Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's new staff webinar for the 811 PRA program. Today's presentation will focus on helping owners meet their responsibilities. Before we get started, I just want to bring up a few housekeeping items. Everyone's line will be muted during the webinar. We will hold a question and answer session at the end of each presentation and at the end of the overall webinar. During the time of the webinar, you can raise your hand, use the raise your hand function if you have any questions that you would like to ask verbally. If you feel like you don't want to answer your question verbally and want to write it down, you can use the question box at any time during the presentation. Now I will turn it over to Kate Moore of True CASA Consulting.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Section 811 Project Rental Assistance Program, Helping Owners Meet Their Responsibilities webinar. This webinar is the sixth of a series of webinars to provide new staff to the Section 811 PRA program targeted information about the program. So let's review the agenda for today. First, we're going to talk about the webinar training series, and then we're going to get started on how the grantees can support the owners who are participating in the 811 PRA program. We'll discuss executing documents, HUD systems, vacancy applicant screening, new tenants, occupancy, asset management, fair housing, and civil rights, and then finally collaboration, including tenancy support. So first, let's just do a recap of the training series that we have been doing. So 811's been around long enough that some states have had staff turnover or other staff might be newly assigned to the program. And this webinar series is designed to support those new staff, as well as other staff members who might want a refresher or an opportunity to learn more about the 811 PRA program. All of these webinars are going to be available on the Section 811 PRA website on the HUD Exchange. The series includes 8 webinars. The first provided an overview of the 811 PRA program. The second discussed methods for identification of units for the program. The third webinar focused on outreach to potential 811 PRA tenants and reviewed all the steps of the program until a tenant moves into a unit. The fourth webinar was on ongoing grantee responsibilities. The fifth webinar was scheduled to be a HUD Systems webinar by Blueprint Solutions to dive deeper into HUD Systems. That has been postponed until late April, and we'll be announcing that webinar soon. But during that time slot, however, we had a webinar regarding reasonable accommodation. The sixth webinar is today. The next webinar will focus on supporting tenants to be successful. And the 8th webinar right now is open to the discussion and interest of the participants. All right, so we're going to start this webinar discussing the documents that you execute with an owner. A previous webinar called Unit Identification walks through the steps of identifying participating properties for the program. Now that you've found a property to participate in the program, the first step you take is executing the documents that will formalize the relationship between the grantee and the owner. And there are 3 documents for execution between the grantee and the property. The first is called the ARAC, or the Agreement to Enter into the Contract. It's an optional document that commits a property to participate in the 811 PRA program in the future. A typical use of this document by grantees is if a property has committed 811 units as part of a competitive capital financing program, such as the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. The ARAC serves as the document to hold that commitment to participate in the 811 program in the future during the construction or rehab of that property that received that capital financing. So the second document is the RAC, or the Rental Assistance Contract, and the third document is the Use Agreement, which creates a 30-year commitment to the program for the property. 30-year commitment is a statutory requirement. So let's talk a little bit more about the RAC. This document is 20 years. It's required between the owner and the grantee, and it has related detail regarding the rights and duties of both the owner and the grantee. And let's walk through the exhibits attached to the RAC. Part 1 is the section that will outline the number of units, the type of units, meaning the bedroom size, the maximum amount of PRA rent the grantee will pay for the units. If you're familiar with the HAP program, this section is similar to those contracts. Part 2, you must decide an annual adjustment factor. This is how rents will be adjusted annually. Options in the RAC include HUD's Operating Cost Adjustment Factor, or OCAF. There are 2 other options which require prior HUD approval. They include another operating cost index that might be used for the grantee, by the grantee for purposes of subsidizing affordable housing, or there might be other means as approved by HUD as well for these annual adjustment factors, which is really your annual rent increases in the rental assistance contract. So the RAC also requires that a utility allowance methodology is selected, which they give options, which include HUD multifamily housing policy, public housing authority policy, rural housing services policy, state or local housing agencies, or other means as approved by HUD. So next, let's discuss the use agreement. The use agreement is a document that must be recorded according to state local law and commits the property to participation to the program for 30 years. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a statutory length of time. This recording of the use agreement keeps requirements to participate in the 811 PRA program with the property, even if the property is sold or transferred to another owner. However, the property can be released from this obligation to the program if federal funds are not available. So let's talk about HUD systems. There are several HUD systems that the property will have to access and use to participate in the program. Some owners will be new to HUD systems. Many owners will have a hired property management firm that works with the property that may have expertise in these HUD systems. Some states have even made experience with these systems a requirement for participation in the 811 PRA program. The first system is called TRACS, or the Tenant Rental Assistance Certification System. The TRACS system is designed to process subsidy contracts, tenant rental assistance information, and owner requests for payment, which is called vouchers in the HUD multifamily division. For the 811 PRA program, owners will use TRACS to provide tenant data and voucher data. Owner payments are based upon the voucher, the contract, and the tenant data residing in that system. So IMAX is the next system. It's a web-based communication system that provides grantees and owners the ability to transmit to HUD data and voucher data files for TRACS. Files sent to HUD are logged, processed, and submitted to TRACS for payment processing by IMAX. The EIV system is the third system. It's a web-based application which provides owners with employment, wage, and unemployment compensation and Social Security benefit information for tenants participating in HUD's housing programs. EIV stands for Enterprise Income Verification. Information in EIV is derived from computer matching programs initiated by HUD with the Social Security Administration and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Information in the EIV system is used by owners to verify employment and income at the time of recertification, and it's used to reduce errors in subsidy payments. And note that for low-income housing tax credit properties, owners will have to keep EIV data in a separate file, as the low-income housing tax credit program is prohibited from using the EIV system. And as I mentioned earlier, I just want to remind folks that we're going to dive a bit deeper into HUD systems at a HUD systems webinar in late April. So if you want more information about these systems and the HUD systems in general, that will be a good one to tune into. All right, and now you have a property that has executed the 811 PRA document and has access to the necessary HUD systems. So we'll now discuss the process of filling vacancies and applicant screening. So let's discuss referrals to the property. Owners must notify the grantee when an 811 PRA unit becomes vacant. Ideally, the owner will notify the grantee as soon as they are aware that a vacancy will become available. The waiting list for the 811 PRA program is kept by the grantee or sometimes by the partnering Health and Human Services Partner Agency. The 811 PRA waiting list is a separate waiting list than the waiting list kept by the property. The property may have a waiting list for their non-811 units, but they will not fill the 811 PRA units from that waiting list. Grantees are managing waiting lists centrally, regionally, and some are even site-based. Owners do not manage these waiting lists, but take referrals for those units from the 811 PRA program. The grantee can refer more than one applicant for each vacancy. Many states are doing this so that the unit can be filled as quickly as possible. The property can screen one application and then quickly move on to the next one if the first one does not work out or decides they do not want the unit. The owner may not charge an application fee for the 811 PRA applicant. So next is screening. The owner is not responsible for determining 811 PRA eligibility. That is done by the grantee or another entity such as a referral agent who has been identified by the grantee to determine they are eligible for the 811 PRA target population for that state. But the owner does screen the household, which includes the PRA eligible household member, which really means the member of the target population, any additional household members, and if applicable, they also screen the live-in aid. The screening done by the property will be done in according to the property's tenant selection plan. The tenant selection plan is approved by the grantee prior to referrals to the property. Typical screening done by a property includes tenancy history and criminal history. The owner will also likely verify income for all household members unless the grantee has designated another entity to do this. Whoever has this responsibility, they must determine that the entire household is at or below 30% of area median income. And they must verify their income, employment, and other income, such as benefits, using the EIB system, as we discussed earlier. The property has the right to deny an 811 applicant if they do not pass the screening criteria in their tenant selection plan. If the property wants to deny an applicant, they must notify the applicant and the grantee for the reason for the denial. The grantee must keep track of these reasons for reporting to HUD. If denied, the applicants have the right to request a reasonable accommodation, to request a meeting with the owner, and to remain on the 811 PRA waiting list for other properties. If you're interested in learning more about reasonable accommodations, there were 2 previously held webinars that might be a good resource. A denial at one property does not make a household ineligible for the 811 PRA program as a whole. The applicant can stay on the 811 PRA waiting list. A denial from one property does not necessarily mean that they will be denied at other properties. If the household is accepted by the property, the owner is responsible for a few items that are specific to the 811 PRA program. Now you have a tenant. This includes completing. Yes.
Oh, it's Lisa. I think we did get a question.
Okay, great.
And actually, you're going to answer this I think you're going to answer it in a few minutes. A question at recertification, but you're going to come up and talk about recertification shortly, right?
I am.
Okay, so I'm going to hold that question, but I do want to give you a chance to take a breath and see if we can encourage people, because Kate's working through the topics pretty quickly. Did you write down a question you have? Raise your hand and Kim will make it so you can talk, unmute you, or put it in the chat box right now. Okay. Don't see anything yet. Let's keep going, but this research question, Kate will get to in a second.
Okay. Yeah, let us know if once I cover that, if it doesn't answer your question. Just a few slides from now. All right, so move-in. We have a tenant, and so the owner is going to have responsibilities for a tenant at move-in specifically. So this includes completing a move-in inspection. The tenant has to be right to be present at the move-in inspection, but is not required to be there. This is a different inspection than the UPCS inspection requirement that must be completed by the grantee. The owner must execute the specific 811 PRA lease with the tenant. So this is the lease that was a part of each grantee's cooperative agreement. They determine tenant rents according to the HUD handbook 4350.3, which is generally about 30% of the household's income minus utility allowance. And then the owner can collect a security deposit. That's an optional, something that they can do. But the PRA program does not allow it to be more than 1 month total tenant payment or $50, whichever is greater. Okay, so let's discuss vacancy payments. So now you move in, and you might have vacancy before you even have your first move-in. An important tool for grantees is that they can pay vacancy payments. This is a decision made by the grantee if they choose to provide a vacancy payment. It's not required. It can be paid for each vacancy that occurs and cannot exceed 80% of the contract rent for that unit for up to 60 days. So it's important to remember that vacancy payments can be included at initial occupancy. So you just now brought that property into a rack. They're offering you their first unit. You can provide vacancy payments at that time. And you can also provide vacancy payments at unit turnover, which means an 811 tenant has moved out, and now there's a vacancy that you're filling with a new tenant. So you can provide vacancy payments at that time as well. All right.
Kate,
so now,
question. Is there an option for an additional security deposit, or can you talk a little bit more about that, please?
You can. That's a good question. So the 811 PRA program will not pay for security deposits. You cannot require the tenant to pay more than their total tenant payment or $50, whichever is greater. But some states have chosen to pay with non-811 funds for additional security deposit because they've heard from their owners a concern about such a small security deposit. So a state could choose if they had some discretionary funding that they felt like could be used for that purpose, that could be used as security deposit.
Yep, 2 examples. I know one state is using home funds, home TBRA, you can use a security deposit, and I believe some states are using MFP funding, admin.
And I think some states, in addition, are interested in trying to, I don't know if anybody's done this yet, Lisa, create a loss mitigation fund. So it's not a security deposit that's tied necessarily to a particular household, but is available to owners. If, for instance, if there are damages to a unit, it's a fund that could be tapped into.
Great.
Okay.
Someone also asked if a tenant is paying in, is it appropriate for a tenant to kind of do a payment plan for their share? And I would think that it could be done as a reasonable accommodation. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that, yeah. Any other questions? All right. Let's keep going with new tenants then. So now that your applicants have been screened and accepted by the property, you have an 811 tenant. And let's discuss some of the requirements for having a new tenant. So as stated earlier, the property must use the HUD model lease, which is the lease that's specific to the 811 PRA program. This is the one that's a part of the grantee's cooperative agreement. It's included as Exhibit 11 of the cooperative agreement. There are required attachments to this model lease. This includes a specific HUD form, which is HUD-50059, which is the owner's certification of compliance with HUD tenant eligibility and rent procedures. You also have to have an attachment of the unit inspection report. This is that unit inspection that we discussed earlier, that move-in inspection. And then these are, if applicable, if the property has house rules, not all properties do, you have to include those. If the property has pet rules, which not all properties do, they have to include those. And if the 811 PRA tenant has a live-in aid, you have to have an addendum that would be attached to the lease that's about the live-in aid. So that's what's required for the lease. We wanted to review briefly the tenant rent calculation. We've covered this in a previous webinar, but one of the main responsibilities for a new tenant is for the owner is calculating the tenant rent. It's called the total tenant payment, or the TTP, in the HUD 811 world. And owners must determine what this TTP is by using the HUD handbook, which again is 4350.3. And generally what TTP is it's the rent plus the utilities. It's what the household can afford for rent and utilities. And what that means is that HUD has determined that a TTP is calculated based off of 30% of the monthly adjusted income, or 10% of the monthly gross income, or the welfare rent, which is in very specific cases. It's the greater of one of those things, according to the HUD handbook. So what can happen is that the tenant rent could be zero, and this could particularly happen if the utility allowance is greater than the total tenant payment. So if they've determined what the utilities would cost in a property is more expensive than what a person can afford to pay in rent, then their rent could be zero. In addition, the household could get a utility reimbursement from the 811 PRA program to help them pay for their utilities by the utilities, and that's by if the utility allowance is greater than the total tenant payment. So that's a situation that can happen as well. All right. So now you have an owner with a tenant, a new tenant, and they have occupying tenants. And so we're going to go over the ongoing responsibility for tenants after move-in. All right. So one of the first ones we had a question about is recertification. So let's go over that and see if it answers your question, and if not, we can come back to you for sure. So owners must recertify the income of 811 PRA households in household composition at least annually, or if there's certain changes within the household. The PRA tenant may also request an interim certification for reasons such as changes in income and increases in medical or child care expenses. So this includes a loss of income, such as due to a job loss or maybe a reduction in work hours. So the owner is required in that case to recalculate the rent based on the new income. So that's really a protection for the tenant, right? So that their rent is based on a certain amount as calculated by the TTP that we discussed in the previous slide. If they have a reduction in income, their rent will be reduced as well to reflect what they can afford. So the PRA household does not have to remain at or below 30% of area median income in order to remain eligible for the 811 PRA unit. If the 811 PRA household's income increases to the point that their total tenant payment, so that's that 30% or 10% or how that was calculated, if it equals the total housing expense for that unit, which is really you could think of as like the regular rent for that unit, the 811 tenant can stay in their housing without the 811 PRA subsidy. That 811 subsidy is then moved to a different unit. Now, the termination of a subsidy at this point will not affect the eligible family's other rights under the lease, nor keep them from being able to resume payments as a result of later changes in their income or other circumstances during the term of the contract. So the grantee needs to develop program policies that address this. They need to decide whether the owner when will they make the next available unit to the PRA program. They need to decide how the tenant may request a resumption of the rental assistance payments if needed. So if their income goes back down, the grantee needs to create a policy of how they could offer rental assistance to that household again. And they need to decide how the tenant can continue to receive services if the household wants to. Okay. So another ongoing issue that the owners will need to know about is overcrowded and underoccupied units. So grantees should address in their 811 PRA tenant selection plan standards for occupancy of units. So this is different than the property one. This should be in the grantee's tenant selection plan. The 811 PRA household sizes can change. The owner will be responsible for following the grantee's written policies in their tenant selection plan regarding family size and determine if the household is either too large or too small for a particular unit. The owner may have to work with the grantee to have a household placed on a waiting list or to transfer units or properties depending on the needs of the household or the policies of the grantee. The 811 PRA program does have a couple of requirements regarding occupancy. However, a single-person household must occupy either a one-bedroom or an efficiency unless a larger unit is needed for a reasonable accommodation, and the owner must notify the grantee of changes in family size. So an important thing to note for this program is tenant organizing. Owners may not impede the efforts of tenants to organize, including unreasonably withholding the use of common rooms. So that's an important thing to make sure that owners understand. Okay, let's discuss evictions. So even with strong support services, it is likely that programs will see some evictions. However, many PSH programs have high rates of retention and low turnover. But evictions will happen with the 811 PRA program, but PRA tenants are protected by the HUD 811 PRA lease, which requires that the owner must have cause, such as non-payment of rent, to evict a household. The grantees are strongly encouraged to require owners to notify the grantee of at-risk tenancies, including 14-day and 30-day notices. This can help grantees and their partner health and human service agencies to reach out to the tenant and the property manager as soon as possible. And grantees and partner agencies are also strongly encouraged to plan how service partner agencies will assist tenants to either prevent evictions or to plan for a new residence if appropriate. Okay. I'll pause for a second. Lisa, do we have anything at this point?
No written questions. Does anybody have want to raise their hand? And Kim will unmute them. Looks like, nope. Kim, do you want to unmute Alana?
So Alana doesn't have her pin in.
Okay.
So she's not being muted. I see that she sent you a question. So
she did. I don't know if that's the question. We can talk there. This PowerPoint will.
So let's discuss asset management. Owners will have some additional ongoing responsibilities related to asset management. One of those is inspections. Owners must make their units, property, and tenant files available for inspection at the request of the grantee. Specifically, grantees will perform a Uniform Physical Condition Standards inspection, which is called a UPCS inspection, on all 811 PRA units and related facilities at least every 3 years. Annually, the owner must inspect all 811 PRA units to determine whether appliances and equipment in the unit are functioning properly and to assess whether a component needs to be repaired or replaced. Rent and utility allowance adjustments are part of what the owner needs to do as well. On the anniversary of the RAC, which is the anniversary date is actually in the RAC itself, Owners are responsible for requesting those allowable rent and utility allowance adjustments. So those are those adjustments that we talked about towards the beginning of the webinar, where in the RAC you decide whether you're going to have allowable rent adjustments by OCAF or by another method approved by HUD. And then those RAC adjustments must be reported by the grantee to HUD. And so that's how the property can ask for, essentially, for contract rent increases if so desired. All right. Anything come up, Lisa, before we dive into fair housing?
Nope. Nothing yet. Please go ahead.
So owners will have fair housing and civil rights requirements to comply with because of their participation in the PRA program. And we're going to review these now. Now, we're going to give you a very broad, brief overview because this is a fairly large topic. But it's important for you to know that what owners must comply with. So they have to comply with all applicable fair housing and civil rights requirements, and we list them out here. This includes the Fair Housing Act, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, Section 504, Title III of the ADA. In addition, owners must comply with HUD's equal access to housing and HUD's programs, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity requirements. And they have to comply with any local discrimination laws as well. So if they're in a state or a city that has their own discrimination laws, they have to comply with those. In addition, related to fair housing and civil rights, owners must comply with effective communication and LEP requirements. Effective communications means that all communications are provided in a manner that is effective for persons with hearing, visual, or other communications-related disabilities. And LEP means that owners must take reasonable steps to ensure meaningful access to their programs and activities to LEP individuals who, as a result of their national origin, are limited in their English proficiency. So these are two additional civil rights and fair housing requirements. So our last topic is collaboration. Many grantees in the beginning stages of the program are concentrated on the referrals and the waiting list portion of the program. Once units are occupied, however, the need for ongoing collaboration between the Housing and Services Agency continues. Grantees and partner agencies need to think through how to best support the owners of the PRA program. The owners are not service providers for this program, and they will need somebody to reach out to if they need assistance with a tenant. So some helpful practices that grantees have used include a single point of contact for owners to make it easy for owners to reach out with any concerns about a tenant, such as non-payment of rent. Tenants can proactively provide permission, like through such as things as like a release of information, for owners to contact case managers, families, or others. And local service agencies can do relationship buildings with housing providers that are not necessarily about a particular 811 tenant, but that create a bridge for all potential and current tenants. So that is all of our official slides.
Great job, Kate. Thank you very much. You covered a lot of ground, and it's clear that owners will be able to take advantage of this webinar once it's recorded and up. Are there any other, does anybody want to raise their hand with any questions, areas that you want further information from Kate, or that you that Kate didn't cover that have come up for you with owners? You can put your question in the question box, or you can raise your hand.
I'm going to take Ayana off mute. Ayana, you can ask your question.
Great, thanks. I just wanted to get some further information about for individuals when they recertify beyond the 30% AMI. So you said it was up to it was beyond even contract rent. It is up to, if they're at if they're in a 50% unit, it could be up at the 50% unit. I mean, well, we actually contract at that, so for a lot of them, so that would be consistent. But it could be up to the rent that other people are paying for that particular type of unit in the property, correct? So, I mean, it doesn't have to be at our contract rent. It could be at the rent for that unit in the property. Am I making sense?
Yes. I think what you're talking about is many of you have an overlay, right? You have an underlying program, and then the 811 goes on top of it, and that underlying program has some requirements. So yeah. I think you're referring to probably like a tax credit unit that in which that unit is supposed to be rented to somebody and have a rent that's affordable to somebody at 50% of AMI or below. So what happens when you put the 811 on top of it? Kate, that was the FAQ that you and Liz and I did.
Okay.
Just the other day. We want to be accurate. So why don't we see if there are any other, can you pull it up? That'd be great.
Yeah.
There is an FAQ addressing this, and since the language matters, I think we want to be very careful. So Kate, when Kate finds it, she can give us the reference for it. People can download it themselves, and maybe you can read the FAQ to us, Kate.
Yeah, just because I think that we may have had someone, because their income did surpass 30% AMI at recertification. And so I think that I wanted to get clear on that, just so then that way we
It's a good question. I think it's going to happen. It's going to, I don't know how common it will be, because many people, their income is SSI, their sole source, and so it'll be hard to get past but for some people that's not the case. And so you will see this problem. Kate, great. There it is. Do you want to read it, just in case anybody can't see their screen?
Yeah, so this says, what happens when a tenant's income increases, such as their rent share is equal to the total contract rent? And then it quotes the part of the RAC, which is part 2, that says, an eligible family's eligibility for rental assistance payments continues until the total eligible family contribution equals the total housing expense for the unit it occupies. The termination of availability at this point will not affect the family's other rights under the lease, nor preclude resumption of payments as a result of later changes in income or other circumstances during the term of this contract. So when a tenant's income increases to this point, the rental assistance payments will cease. The tenant has the right to remain in place in accordance with their lease. And then it talks, which I talked about, the policies that you should create. So does that answer your question?
So I'm just going to summarize a little bit, Kate. The 811 program allows the person to stay in place, Alana, when the individual goes up to 50. Then potentially the question is, can they stay in place when they go up to 60? When the owner accepts the PRA unit, the answer is yes. They can't evict them just because their income goes up. Okay, if it's a tax credit program, there's a whole, your tax credit unit will have a whole guidance, I imagine, on something called the next available unit and helping properties stay within the tax credit guidelines.
So then they defer if they go over, since basically it's a layered property now with HUD 811 in it. Then they defer then to their tax credit guidelines?
No, it's the opposite.
Okay.
It's the opposite.
Then they go to the 43.
Right. You should. Okay. This is something that your tax credit folks should have experience with, because they have and this is what you could talk to them about. I'm sure they have projects in which PBV project-based voucher from the Housing Choice Voucher Program, Section 8 program, is layered on top of some of the PRA units. And a lot of those folks will have an income that is more than whatever the target is, but it's allowable. You're serving a low-income person, and because it's more about the rent level and who you're serving than it is. So it's acceptable in the PBV program, and this is parallel to that. And so I would recommend you go talk to your tax credit folks about how they do it with PBV. It's going to be the same answer.
Great. Okay, thanks.
Let's see. Are there other questions or comments? Yep. So here's a question, Kate. Do we as grantees have any other recourse besides referring a tenant to legal aid, et cetera, when an owner isn't complying with fair housing laws?
Wow, that's a big question. I think it depends on what the fair housing law is. Is that a written? I guess that's a written question.
Question. Yep.
Yeah. I would think that you, as a grantee, would have a lot of recourse to hold them to the terms of the rental assistance contract, which includes compliance with the Fair Housing Act. And I would work with your compliance division on, what they typically do in that case, because that wouldn't be unique to the 811 program. I don't know what you think, Lisa. What do you think?
No, I agree. I think it's about it's a circumstance. So let's think of some circumstance. I agree totally. Some circumstances are more clear than others. You send 100, over time you send 100 tenants to an owner. 50% of them are white. Another 50% are people of color. The owner, you realize when you look at your stats, they've taken only white tenants. You have some concerns, maybe you investigate it, and you think that there's something going on there. That's clearly a compliance. It's a compliance issue. So as Kate says, you can leverage maybe compliance on the tax credit side. What's, complicated is what happens if there's an owner who is participating with the program because they got points, in their application for home or tax credit, but they don't really want to do it. And now they, they're doing things to kind of get out of this option. You really have to make friends with your compliance division and get them to, to push back a little bit. A different example, less clear, is what, if any of you watch the reasonable accommodation trainings that Kate mentioned earlier, reasonable accommodation is something that's provided under fair housing law. So it's a it's a hard area, it's a gray area. What if you feel like the owner, you send 10 people over and they all have, kind of some difficult tenancy issues, and you've asked for reasonable accommodation and they're not giving any reasonable accommodations. What do you do then, right? Again, it's more of a gray area, right? But they're not taking anybody. So I think you could go to compliance. I think you could, it's important to sit down and talk to the owner, figure out what the issues are. I guess there may be situations in which you would, a service provider might refer a tenant to legal aid, but hopefully it hasn't happened much. And if it is happening in your state, if that wasn't a hypothetical, it was a real example, then it would be important to talk to your TA lead to kind of brainstorm, because it's a bad thing that's happening. Sorry, Kate, back to you.
No, that's great. Thank you.
Let's see if there are any hands up. I don't see any hands up. Please put your questions in the question box. No question is not not a good question. We're all learning as we go. Kim, I don't see anybody with hands raised. Do you?
Nope, I don't see anyone with hands raised, and we have no questions in the question box.
Okay. Back to you, Kate.
All right. Well, if there's no other questions, then that concludes our webinar for today. I encourage you to attend our next webinar on tenancy support. And we will be getting in touch further about the 8th webinar and how to participate in that as well, which is more open at this point for discussion and interest of the group. So I thank you for participating in the webinar today, and have a great day.